Thank you. I have the privilege of introducing our plenary guest speaker, Brian McLaren. I'm going to give a formal introduction in case some of you are not aware, though I know most of us are, about Brian and his writings, and then I'll share just a few personal things. Brian McLaren is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian, a former college English teacher and pastor. He's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He's a champion for a more loving, inclusive, and contemplative Christianity. He teaches ways to reconnect with the message that Jesus lived and died for, unconditional love. He's the author of numerous best-selling books, and many of us have read them, such as his more recent book, Faith After Doubt, and The Great Spiritual Migration, A New Kind of Christianity, A Generous Orthodoxy, and A Naked Spirituality. Not XXX, mind you. His recent projects include the Galapagos Islands, A Spiritual Journey, and his next book release, which comes out in spring of next year, Do I Stay Christian? He's a faculty member of the Living School and a podcaster on learning how to see, which are both part of the Center for Action and Contemplation. He's also an Auburn scholar, our senior fellow, and works closely with the Wild Goose Festival and Progressive Christianity. He was born in 1956, graduated from the University of Maryland, degrees in English, and both his BA and his MA. His academic interests include medieval drama, romantic poets, modern philosophical literature, and the novels of Walker Percy. In 2004, he was awarded a Doctor of Divinity degree from Carey Theological Seminary in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada. And then 2010, he received a second honorary degree from Virginia Theological Seminary, an Episcopal seminary. He has taught and lectured at many seminaries and denominational and ecumenical and interfaith gatherings around the world. He's married to Grace, that's probably the most important thing, and that they have 4 adult children and 5 grandchildren. You'd never know it looking at him. He's an avid wildlife and outdoors enthusiast who believes God's first language is this amazing universe. I will even say this amazing universe of Wyoming, because he brought his fishing rod with him. On a more personal level, I'm very honored to call Brian my friend. I have been blessed by him in many ways. Yes, by his writings and his teaching, but I've got to tell you, I am immeasurably blessed because he exudes graciousness. And that's precious. It is my privilege to introduce him. He will be speaking on this first session, Why the New Frontier Matters, Past, Present, and Future. Would you please welcome with me, Brian McLaren.
Thank you. Well, thank you for those kind words. And so I'm so happy to be here. I'm so glad I got to be here for this whole morning. Who knew a foundation report meeting would be so great? But it really was, and I can just feel the love of this community. This really is something special. And I don't know if any of you are at this moment taking it for granted, but I'll just tell you that someone from the outside comes in, and it's just like, it's just beautiful. So it's great to be here. And I also want to say the words that the bishop shared this morning in his kind of call to all of you, I just think those are, everything I'm going to say will be a small footnote to what he shared this morning. So I'm very happy to be with you. And I can't remember exactly how we met, but it had to do, I think, with the fact that the bishop spent so much of his life in the Middle East and been involved in Christians and Muslims learning to live as neighbors and not kill each other. What a concept. And that's something I felt called to as well. Some years ago, I was invited to be part of something called the Common Word process. I don't know if you all remember, some years ago, the previous Pope said some unflattering things about Muhammad at a big speech in Regensburg, Germany. And there were demonstrations around the Muslim world, and the largest group of Muslim scholars ever in history to come together to issue a joint statement, got together, and they wrote a letter to the Pope, and they said, yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but they said, listen, if you say things about our prophet and our religion that get people in the streets ready for war, it might be a good idea that you could talk to us before you talk about us, and might be a good idea if we could talk to you. Wouldn't it be a nice idea if the leaders of the world's religions actually talked to each other? And then, yeah. And here's how they began the document. They said, in the Gospels, Jesus teaches that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we, as the largest group of Muslim scholars who ever have come together to issue any statement, would like to say, we believe Jesus was right, we agree, and we would like, in the name of Jesus, to speak to you Christians as neighbors in love. What a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, they got no answer to their letter. And it went, I think, for 18 months with no answer. And so then a group of Christian scholars said, we're going to pick up the ball on that, and we're going to respond. And I was honored to be one of the initial respondents. And at any rate, I've been a huge fan of Bishop Chandler's work in this area. And when I heard that he was coming here, I just thought, Wyoming is really lucky, and you all are lucky to have him. Blessed to have him. And then this morning, when I heard him talking about a new era in the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the native peoples of this land, you understand how significant that is. And what I'm going to share with you in a few minutes, I think at the end of this session, you'll feel even more how significant this is. And when you said, Bishop, maybe we ought to ask if we could start all over again, what would we do? Can I just tell you, I think that's the question. You not only have to ask as the Wyoming front of the Jesus movement, as the presiding bishop would probably like to say, but that's the question the entire Christian religion has to ask. What would it be like for us to start over now, knowing what we know? You might say with 2,000 years of practice and mistakes and learnings, what could we do now? I also, many of you know Dave Tomlinson, a wonderful dear friend from England, was going to be your speaker, and because of COVID restrictions wasn't able to come. And I just want to say, I hope you'll get to hear him sometime. Dave has had a big influence on me, has been a good friend to me. What a dear person. The only other person I've really known in this whole diocese before today, and I feel like I've already got a bunch of new friends, was Jimmy Bartz. And I wanted to tell you about how I originally heard about Jimmy. I had a crotchety old friend who was just a guy who could complain about anything with eloquence. And yet, he was the most lovable, sweet-hearted, good-natured guy. He just passed away about a year ago. His name is Skip Smith. And Skip and I have been friends for many years. In fact, Skip really was a mentor to me in many, many ways. But he had stopped going to church. He was a deeply spiritual man, but he had not been involved with church. So we were on the phone once many years ago, and Skip, who lived in Los Angeles, near Los Angeles, said to me, hey, Brian, I hope you're sitting down. He said, I'm thinking, what bad news do I have? I said, well, I am sitting down. What is it? I've started going back to church. And believe it or not, it's an Episcopal church. It's this guy named Jimmy Bartz. I hope you get to meet him someday. So that was my original introduction to Jimmy. If Jimmy could get skipped going back to church, that's quite significant. And so I'm thankful to all of you for your attention and opportunity to be with you. Just a bit about me. First, I really want to join all of you in honoring the indigenous peoples of this land and all the peoples who've called this land home. And I also want to honor the non-human neighbors that are appreciated here in Wyoming, the common ones, but also the ones who are in some risk, the Canada lynx, the yellow-billed cuckoo, the West Glacier stonefly, the white-bark pine tree. And to tell you, I was born in upstate New York in the land of the Seneca Nation. And I currently live in the land of the Seminole, and before them the Calusa, and before them the Muspa and unknown Paleo Indians, which is also the land of the gopher tortoise, the manatee, and the Florida panther. And I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian background, super conservative. Some of you maybe have some affinity, or you had a similar background. But I grew up among people who were quite sure that all Episcopalians had a very hot future. And I should also say, I was a pastor for 24 years. I was a college English teacher, began my career in higher education, loved literature, got involved with a little experimental new church that developed. We actually petitioned the Episcopal diocese where we lived to see if we could become an Episcopal congregation. And there were political problems behind that. So behind the scenes, the vestry of that congregation pulled us aside and they said, you can't wear the Episcopal t-shirt, but you're already playing the game, just get on with it. So they played a role in us forming this congregation, of which I later became the pastor. I served that church for 24 years. During that time, I began writing and eventually felt that my calling was to try to encourage churches in general. And so I left that congregation, which I still dearly love, 16 years ago. And for the last 16 years, I've been a writer and a speaker. And in that time, I actually have become a huge, huge fan of Wyoming. As the bishop already mentioned, you all really do have some nice trout here. And I'm quite certain there's a lot of people in the room who will feel a deep amen when I say that for some of us, fishing is a spiritual practice. It truly is. And it is it has its own vestments. I mean, the ritual of it is, it has repetitive activities. It has all kinds of things. And in fact, this summer for the first time, I got all of my grandchildren out here to Wyoming, and we had an amazing time. I got my wife on a horse. This has not happened many times in our lives. And of course, encountered some of the more interesting Wyoming neighbors, too. But in this session, I'd like to talk about this theme, Christ on the new frontier. And I'd like to talk about why the new frontier matters and looking at the past, present, and future. A very wise Methodist, retired Methodist minister and consultant named John Janka, who became a dear friend of mine some years ago, said there's an unspoken, unwritten job description that every pastor, priest, and bishop is given. Here it is. Keep the people comfortable so they keep coming back and giving. Then he says, but there's one problem. Comfortable people normally don't grow and change. I mean, isn't that true? What's pushed all of us to growth and change is discomfort. And yet, this is a deep, deep struggle in so many congregations. Keep the people happy. Keep the people comfortable so they'll keep coming back and keep giving and keep the thing afloat. Don't ruffle feathers. Walk on eggshells. Be careful. But when we do that, we then fall prey to giving people permission to stagnate. And so I sort of want to apologize, but part of my job in this session is, with your permission, if I don't succeed, you have to tell me later, but I would like to try to make you uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, not to the degree that you shut down and get angry and react, but to the degree that you consider the possibilities of growth and change. And there's a wonderful plan for discomfort. It's just looking at the past, looking at the present, and looking at the future. And let's start with the past. When we say the word frontier in the theme for these days, when we say the word frontier, we're evoking a deeply American story, the story of westward expansion, that was told to me one way when I was a kid growing up in elementary school. And a whole big part of that story was kept a secret. But very few of us know the backstory to that American story. And it's a story that's deeply, deeply, deeply theological. And I'd like to share it with you. We all know about 1492. But to understand this story, we have to go to 1452. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1452, Pope Nicholas told European Christians what to do. You see, he was having a conflict with Muslims who were coming up through Turkey into Eastern Europe. And he was having a lot of battles, and he anticipated more battles. And he needed to raise significant amounts of money for war. And so he wrote a letter to the King of Portugal. And then this letter to the King of Portugal was expanded to include the King and Queen of Spain and the King of France. And it was extended to the entire European Christian world. It was one original letter that was followed up by a series of letters that I think is one of the most important and most deadly doctrines in human history and in Christian history. Not doctrines, documents in human history and in Christian history. And it's collectively, this set of documents are called the doctrine of discovery. The first version of it is called Dum Diversas. It's a Latin term. But this is the letter that went out to first the King of Portugal and then all of the kings of Europe. He said, I'm sending you into all the world, he said, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, that was Muslims, and pagans whatsoever. That's everybody else. I'm sending you into the world to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ. Now, the rest of the world have been rendered as enemies of Christ. Wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors, meaning you as the king, any land that you conquer, you now own the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. Notice that word convert. Not to convert them to Jesus and his gospel, to convert them to his use and profit. Now, this document, look, I'm a well-read guy. I am a total nerd. I love research and reading. I'm into this, right? I don't think I ever even heard of the doctrine of discovery until I was around 50 years old. And if you've never heard of it, I don't blame you. This doctrine has been hiding underneath Western civilization. And can I say, among white Christians, it has been kept a secret. Interestingly, the phrase doctrine of discovery comes up in the Declaration of Independence. And there are several Supreme Court decisions that refer back to it. So it's deeply even embedded in American political documents. But these chilling words unleash the era of the conquistadors, the era of the colonists and colonies. And in fact, although probably none of them knew it, many of the people who came westward across the United States were part of the outflow of this document. I've just done Ancestry.com. I've been studying my ancestors, and it turns out I have ancestors all across Europe. I just stumbled in. My wife is 100% Sicilian. My mother-in-law said when I proposed to her daughter, my mother-in-law said, well, if you couldn't be an Italian, at least you were smart enough to marry an Italian. And I actually just found out that I have an Italian relative back from the 1600s. But I have ancestors who were in Massachusetts since since the very early days of colonization. Probably very few of them knew that in many ways what brought them to the United States was part of this deadly document and doctrine of discovery. So when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and landed in Hispaniola, where he was discovered by the native peoples, he didn't discover them, they discovered him, and he met the Taino peoples, who, by the way, the people of the little island where I live on the southwest coast of Florida traded with. There was a big trading routes that went from the Caribbean all the way up the Mississippi Valley. In 1495, when Columbus came back from his second voyage, here's what he wrote. He wrote, "It is possible with the name of the Holy Trinity to sell all the slaves which it is possible to sell. Here there are so many of these slaves. Although they are living things, they are as good as gold." So when you feel the impact of those words, this was when Columbus saw these people, he was seeing through the eyes of the doctrine of discovery. Now, those of us who are Protestant, we might think, well, that's a Catholic thing. Oh, no, no, no. You have to understand, of course, the Reformation happened a generation or so after the doctrine of discovery. And in many ways, you understand, when the English built their global empire, in a sense, they got to keep all the profits for themselves and didn't have to share any with Rome. Do you understand? There's a dimension of this among Protestants that is even more brutal. So it was some years later that a First Nation scholar in Canada named Waziatawan wrote, "The people of Hispaniola had their lives unjustly and savagely taken by, as De las Casas repeatedly notes, professed Jesus followers, and they were not, as we all know, the only ones to meet such a fate. Millions of their indigenous sisters and brothers on Turtle Island were killed at the hands of other Europeans, as nation after imperial nation, bearing Christ on their lips and crosses on their military standards, followed suit." Waziatawan, in fact, the paragraph I'm about to read you has an interesting story. A group of, in Canada, the churches of Canada have been much farther ahead in facing the legacy of colonization than most of the churches in the United States. And some years ago, I think it was the United Church of Canada and the Mennonite Church of Canada got together and wrote a book about the attempts of the Christian church to make the kind of new beginning that Bishop Chandler talked about this morning. And Waziatawan wrote a piece as a Native person, First Nations person, and I was invited to be a Christian respondent to her. And so she wrote a chapter, and then I wrote a response. And the publishers wouldn't publish her piece as it was written. They changed it because they felt it was too fiery, especially this paragraph. So I wrote to Wazia Talon and I said, they will not publish this, but is it okay with you if I use your original version? So here's what she wrote. From this vantage point, Christianity has nothing, absolutely nothing, to teach indigenous peoples about how to live in a good way on this land. Now, you might not agree with her, but until you understand the reason she has to say that, I don't think you should disagree. I think we should listen. She says, in fact, Christians have only demonstrated that there's something profoundly wrong with the cosmology and worldview behind more than 5 centuries of carnage that has yet to even slow down. Christians have so much negative history and dogma to overcome within their own tradition. I do not believe the religion is even salvageable. The world is deep in the throes of an ecological crisis based in Western economies of hyper-exploitation. The planet will not survive another 500 years of Christian domination. And I think she speaks the truth unless people like you, people like us, are willing to show that the Christian religion is salvageable. But you can't promise it until you demonstrate it. You can't assert it until you embody it. And that, to me, when we look at this moment in light of this past, we see that we have a lot of history in our first 2,000 years as a religion that we need to take seriously. It goes way back to the 1st and 2nd centuries when the Christian religion turned on its mother. Jesus, a Jew, all the first apostles, Jews, become anti-Semitic within a few generations of Jesus. And if you don't know about this history, there's all kind of research you can do. I'm actually writing this book I have coming out in March. I try to talk about this a bit. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, here Jesus, who elevates women, who has Mary sitting at his feet as a disciple. You understand, sitting at his feet was a position of honor. It was the position that only men usually were allowed. And when Martha tried to criticize her sister, she should be in the kitchen helping me. Jesus said, no, this is fine. Don't bother her, you know. What you're doing is good too. But Jesus, who elevated women, the religion begins to suppress women. And by the way, I hope you understand, Episcopalians, you take for granted that you have women priests and bishops. But it hasn't been that long. You don't take it for granted. That's right. And can you remember that the vast, vast, vast majority of Christians consider you, the people I grew up with, consider you all really off the tracks because you treat women as equals. Do you understand that? You all are truly extraordinary. When you want to talk about going to the frontier, you've been going to the frontier for quite a while now. And that's really remarkable. By the 4th century, with the conversion of Christianity to Constantine, I know I'm saying that different than the way people usually say it, but then the Christian religion becomes a religion that welcomes torture, banishment, and execution. For centuries, at least 40,000, in the Middle Ages, 40,000 women were burned as witches. And there are so many dimensions to this, but can I tell you something I just learned when I was writing my next book? Protestants, Catholics started doing some witch burnings. Protestants took it up with a vengeance. It was as if they were saying, hey, if you're going to join a religion, why don't you join the most misogynistic one, that you possibly can, because we kill a lot of witches, And of course we have the Crusades, the doctrine of discovery I've mentioned, and then all that leads to with global conquest, the African slave trade, white European empires and supremacy, and then in the 20th century, the relationship between Christianity and Hitler, a story that is not told in the way it needs to be told. And then both among Catholics and Protestants. And then Christianity and capitalism and militarism, And then in the 20th century, a resurgence of 21st century, a resurgence of Christian ethno-nationalism in the US, in Russia, in the UK, in Brazil, and it's springing up in many, many places. And I don't mean to be an alarmist, my brothers and sisters, but here's my concern. My concern is because we have hidden our history from ourselves. And by the way, you aren't to blame for this. Other people hid it from you. But now, if you begin to know it and you decide to hide it from others, well then, you're culpable. But I know you won't do that. When we face the history of our past, we decrease the chances of it being repeated. But you understand, I'm 65 years old. I'm getting up there. A few of you are ahead of me, but I'm getting up there. But I'm old enough to remember when there were debates about censorship of textbooks in schools. And you understand there's this big resurgence of censorship of textbooks going on today because people don't want the truth of our past to be told. Now, there's all kinds of discussions we could have about that. But let's just say, if we don't learn the lessons of our past, if we don't face our past, we may repeat it. And if we want a better future, brothers and sisters, we need to go to the frontier, and part of that frontier is acknowledging the full truth about our past, wanting to know the most of it, not the least of it. I was speaking in the UK once, and I was on a speaking tour when I'd written a book about Christian identity in a multi-faith world. It was called Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road? That was the long title of the book. And each night in each city, I had a different conversation partner, usually never a Christian, always a Muslim or a Jew or a Sikh. And in one city, I was with a Muslim born in Algeria, a brilliant scholar, and she was so suspicious of me, and she had every reason to be. I was American, she had all kinds of reasons to be suspicious. But by the end of the night, it felt like we'd earned each other's trust. And after the event was over, we had this public conversation. It was a fascinating conversation. At the end of the night, she pulled me aside, and she said, those faults of Christian history that you talked about. I said, yeah. She said, we've known about those for a long time. I said, yeah, I'm sure you have. She said, but we don't hear Christians talk about them too much. I said, yeah, it's not easy. I get a lot of pushback sometimes. She says, yeah, well, here's what she said. If you can get Christians talking about your history, then we can get Muslims talking about our history. But when you won't talk about your history, we talk about your history, and it keeps us from talking about our history. Do you see how that works? So, if we face our past, it will make it impossible for you to go on with Christianity as usual. You'll want to follow Christ to the front edge of the new frontier. And instead of being afraid to say, let's go forward, you'll be saying, please lead us forward, Jesus, please lead us forward. Because as the bishop said earlier, we have to begin again. Let's talk about the present. We all know the statistics about a shrinkling church. That's a word that has been invented to combine shrinking and wrinkling. As I told you, I grew up very conservative, and for about 30 or 40 years, evangelicals loved to talk about their superiority over mainline Protestants, including Episcopalians, because evangelicals were growing and mainline Protestants were declining. But what has turned out to be the case is that evangelical demographic patterns, white evangelical demographic patterns, are just following those of mainline Protestantism about 35 years later. And they reached their peak right around the turn of the millennium, and their numbers are now rapidly declining. And they're now, many of them are still spouting their superiority, but it's just because they haven't read the more recent data. And I'm an example of it. I grew up in that world, and I couldn't stay there any longer. Thank God there were Episcopalians to accept me, who had low enough standards to accept someone like me. But listen, when I, came into the mainline Protestant world, and you all had 35 or 40 years of statistics of decline, a whole lot of people started saying, why are the young people leaving? Why are the young people leaving? And the first phase is they asked it like this: what's wrong with those young people? And that they have a period of that. Evangelicals are still doing that. They're still talking about what's wrong with those young people. But now what I hear among people like you is, no, we can't blame the young people. We have to look and say, what's going on? We have some deeper questions to ask. We have to move to the new frontier. When people ask, why are the young people leaving, the reasons are very, very complex, and there's no simple answer. But I will say a big part is when young people understand something about the history that brings us to where we are, and they enter churches that act as if that history never happened, it feels ethically dirty to be part of a group like that. Do you understand? I can offer you an analogy. I'm not making an equivalence, but it is an analogy. Imagine if you were in Germany and there was a group you wanted to join, but that group acted as if World War II and the Holocaust never occurred. You would say, I'm not sure this is a safe group to be part of, right? And so this sense that in especially European-based Christianity, there's this denial of the past, which means there's no acknowledgement of the harms done by our members of our religion using our theology. That's a big part of this problem, especially when we have this resurgence of white Christian nationalism that is, in a sense, buying in to many of these old narratives. But I think if you want a simple way to understand one main reason, not the only reason, but one main reason why young people are leaving, here's what it is. They're outgrowing our form of Christianity. The way I describe it in the book I have back here, Faith After Doubt, is there's all kinds of research now on how faith develops in people. And I synthesized the work of about a dozen of the main theorists in this area. And I present a synthesis of other people's work that's 4 stages: simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony or solidarity. Simplicity is dualism. Us, them, good, bad, in, out. God's people, the devil's people. That kind of dualism. And that kind of dualism is where kids grow up. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? They want to know the simple, easy answers. And the fact is, the Christian religion has specialized in stage 1 theology for much of its history. And even though I don't meet very many stage 1 Episcopalians, there's a lot of the liturgy that reflects that kind of stage 1 thinking. And that's where a lot of people are. And then people live in simplicity. Some live there for their entire lives. This makes perfect sense to me, especially because people used to get married when they were 17 or 18 years old. And then they would spend the next 25 or 30 years raising children, big families. And so when you think they were in simplicity until they had children, and then they had to raise their children through simplicity, And they didn't live much longer after that. So everyone was preoccupied with simplicity. But more and more people at younger and younger ages move beyond simplicity to complexity. You know, my grandfather grew up in Rochester, New York. One of my grandfathers, I don't think he ever met a Muslim. I don't think he ever met a Hindu. I think he met a Jew, but he never had a Jewish friend. My grandchildren meet Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and have Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu friends. They meet them every day before lunch. They play on the playground with them. It's their world. And so when you live in a world where your group looks at it this way, and that group looks at it that way, and that group looks at it that way, and that group looks at it that way, and you have to get along with all of them, you enter the world of complexity at a much younger age. You have to negotiate complicated worlds and figure out how to get along with people who see the world very, very differently. And then a lot of people stay there the rest of their lives. I think many of our churches, especially mega churches, have been doing a little bit better with people in complexity. But then more and more people at a younger and younger age are moving into perplexity. Perplexity, where they start caring about the harm that's being done by all the people in simplicity and complexity. And when that happens, and their appetite for justice and truth-telling predominates, then for very many of them, there is no place they're welcome in the Christian faith. I want to tell you something. So many of my evangelical friends end up as Episcopalians because it's the only place where they can find room to be in perplexity. But there's so much more that this community could do to help people who are moving into perplexity. And you all could really be at the forefront of this, and especially when we say that after people spend a little while in perplexity, where they're experiencing skepticism and relativism, what happens when you become skeptical of your own skepticism and you start to relativize your own relativism and you begin to become cynical about your own cynicism and you turn the tools by which you critique others on yourself and you have a kind of spiritual breakdown that leads to a spiritual breakthrough into what we might call harmony or solidarity. That's the zone where the mystics and the contemplatives have lived through the centuries. And there are very few Christian communities that even know this exists and don't know how to bring people there. And brothers and sisters, if you develop liturgies that bring people, accept people where they are in each stage, but make it like a pathway to the frontier of harmony and solidarity, that could be a great future. The question shouldn't be, how do we get them back? It should be, why should they come back? How can we become the kinds of places that they would like to come back? And we'll talk about that more in the days to come. Meanwhile, so many of us, we just go through our activities Sunday by Sunday. And I don't blame you for this. Look, I was a pastor for 24 years, and for all the priests here, let me just say, this is a hard job. And for all of you who aren't priests, please understand, there are so many people on the verge of quitting across the world of clergy in the United States. It was bad before COVID, but COVID has just kicked the stuffing out of so many. Not everybody, but an awful lot. So I understand what people do is they get the checklist mentality. They act as if God's sitting up in heaven, and every 6 days or so, God starts feeling a little itchy and thinks, gosh, I really need a prologue. I really need a prelude, and I really need somebody to show up in a narthex. And I sure need a sacristy or two to make it through another week. In other words, that there's these things that God needs for us to do to keep the world operating for another week, you know. And it's understandable that we get into that line of thinking. But brothers and sisters and friends, if we just have that checklist mentality, to be successful Episcopalians is to make it until the next convention and to make sure that we've gotten all the parts of the liturgy done 52 times between now and then, plus a few for holidays. If we act as if our past is fine and our present is fine, then, brothers and sisters, we will not go to the new frontier. But when we start to say our past has issues and our present is unsustainable, then we're ready to think about the future. And when you think about the future, you realize that the future has some possibilities. One possibility is secularism. When I was a kid growing up, I think most educated people thought that religion would fade away and the world would become secular. But here's the issue. If the world becomes secular, what becomes the driving motivation of the world? Is it racial supremacy? In the absence of religion, a lot of people are making their race their new absolute. I was in Charlottesville in August of 2017 as part of the clergy counter-protest to the Unite the Right white supremacist rally. I was about as far as I am from the antlers at the back of the room when a car ran through the crowd and killed a woman named Heather Heyer and injured a bunch of other people. And when I was a pastor, I normally didn't wear vestments, but they asked all of us to wear vestments that day. And I will never forget running down the hill with my leather shoes slapping on the street, and my, stole flapping in the wind, running down the street. And there were people lying on the ground, and we were there. There was all these clergy there before the first responders were there. And all that day long, it's a day I'll never forget. I just can't tell you, I never, ever thought I would see people walking down the streets of America carrying Nazi flags and white supremacist flags and shouting anti-Semitic slogans and be 100% sure they were right. And so I don't know what secularism gets framed by. I actually don't think secularism is the likely future in the short run. I think a more likely future is a resurgence of religious fundamentalism. I think a kind of desperate religious fundamentalism is on the rise, and it's being supported by people who aren't even religious because it gives them everything they want, plus the veneer of morality. And in fact, in the latest research, the growing number of people who identify as evangelical are not even church-going people. It's now become a way to say, I'm a part of a group that has a set of values and I feel moral about it. And when you think about those possible futures, and I'll be honest with you, I think they are likely. Then you think, is there a best case scenario? And when you identify a best case scenario, then you say, it will probably not happen unless a whole lot of us put our lives and hearts into it. Joanna Macy called it a great turning. She was thinking about ecology, that if we don't learn to live differently with the earth, that we don't have a future. But here's what she said. She realized it's not just that we need to become an ecological civilization, we have to be ecological in a spiritual way. We have to see the sacredness of creation. And so she called for a great turning that was an inward turning. And when I came across that phrase from her years ago, I thought, when you want to talk about a great turning, I mean, Jesus was about turning. Remember, he constantly said, you have heard it said, but I say to you. He turned things upside down. One of his key words in his message was repent, which means turn around, change your way of thinking. He even literally turned tables on religion and economics in his day. And he talked about turning the other cheek, which is a call toward nonviolent action. And so it strikes me that at this moment, Jesus could be our leader into a great turning for all of us who are Christians. And the good news I can tell you is that we have Muslim friends who are having similar conversations. I promise you, because I have friends who are involved in these conversations, there are Muslims who are having conversations about the future and the future of Islam and the dangers of extremist Islam, just as we're having to have conversations about the dangers of extremist Christianity. And they're trying to figure out, how do we have a great turning in Islam? I have dear friends who are rabbis who are deeply, deeply disturbed by what's happening in the state of Israel. And they're saying, as Jews, we have to embody a better kind of Judaism, a new kind of Judaism for this world to see. And they're having these kinds of conversations. And they won't talk about being with Christ at the new frontier, but they might talk about discovering Torah at a new frontier. Or in Islam, they might talk about ijtihad, which means radical rethinking at the new frontier. But as Christians, we have our job to go to this, or our opportunity to go to this new frontier. The last thing I want to say is that adventures are not comfortable. That's one thing about adventures. You know, a lot of folks in Wyoming, you get out and you camp and you hike, and your bed is way more comfortable. You know, I mean, a Motel 6 is more comfortable. But comfort is not adventuresome. And when you want adventure in your life, when you want to feel you're alive, when you want to not just survive, but thrive, you find out that adventure is worth the discomfort. And I think when we feel that discomfort, and when we don't see it as a bad thing, but see it as the entry price, as the gateway to adventure, I think we will be ready to consider joining Christ at the new frontier. Just in closing, I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that nobody's going to fix all this for us. I have a super, super high opinion of your bishop. He is incapable of fixing this for everybody. You know, I have a super, super high opinion of Pope Francis, but you know, a high percentage of the American bishops are doing everything they can to oppose Pope Francis. And that's true in some other places in the world too. I want to tell you a secret. A friend of mine got an invitation to the Vatican back in 2000, I think it was 17. Got an invitation to the Vatican, and he had no idea why he was being called to the Vatican. He didn't know if he was in trouble or what. When he got there, he found a couple of hundred other people. Not all of them were Christians. There was at least one Jew there, because he told me about her. And not all of them, if you're into politics and that sort of thing, were even pro-life. But they were there, and the Pope said, the reason I've invited you here is I'm about to come out with an encyclical. It's a letter to all the peoples of the world. It was called Laudato Si. And then he came out with another one called Fratelli Tutti. I think two of the most, as ugly as that document we looked at earlier, those two documents are beautiful and healing documents. But he said, I'm about to send this letter out to the whole world. And when the letter comes out, many of my bishops will oppose me. The reason I've invited you here is to ask for your help in getting this message out. So nobody at the top can fix this. It's going to be all of us being involved together. And can I just say, and I feel this more after being here with you this morning, Wyoming is a great place for the Episcopal wing of the Jesus movement to join Christ on the new frontier. The experiments that you launch, the innovations that you dare, the adventures that you take, the liturgies you create, the things you give permission to do, the things that happen here could reverberate very, very far and very, very wide. You know, I was sitting in the back looking this morning, and I was thinking, you know, Jesus, when he started, he had 11 guys left at the end of his ministry. And then somewhere between 70 and 120 other women and men who were part of that larger group. It was just, let's say maximum 200 people. There were less people following Jesus at the beginning of this movement than there are in this room right now. Fewer people then. And so if we dare to join Christ on the new frontier, I cannot imagine what is possible. Could we just take a moment of silence? And I'd like to invite you, just in your own heart, for just a few seconds to utter a word or a sentence in your own heart to God. And I say from the bottom of my heart, God bless you all to join Christ on the new frontier. Amen.